Before there was oil, before there was cotton, before there was coal, before any of the commodities that we associate with the modern global economy had been dragged from the earth and assigned a price, there was pepper, and nutmeg, and cloves, and cinnamon, small, dry, seemingly insignificant things that you could hold in the palm of your hand. Things that today sit in small plastic jars on supermarket shelves and cost almost nothing. Things that, for nearly 2,000 years, were among the most valuable substances on the surface of the earth. Things that men were willing to cross oceans for, willing to kill for, willing to build empires for. This is the story of the spice trade. And it is not a polite story. To understand why spices mattered so much, you have to step inside the reality of life in medieval Europe. There was no refrigeration. There was no canning. There was no way to preserve meat through a long winter except salt, smoke, and whatever else you could find that slowed the inevitable. Spices slowed it. They masked the smell of meat that was turning. They made food that had been stored for months bearable, sometimes even pleasurable. In a world where famine was a recurring event and the line between eating and not eating was thinner than most people today can imagine, that was not a luxury. That was survival technology. But spices were more than preservation. They were medicine, or at least they were believed to be, and in a world without germ theory or modern pharmacology, belief was everything. Cloves were used to treat toothache. Nutmeg was believed to ward off plague. Cinnamon was prescribed for everything from digestive problems to heart conditions. The physicians of medieval Europe wrote entire treatises on the curative properties of spices, and their patients paid fortunes to follow the prescriptions. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century and killed somewhere between a third and half of the entire population, the demand for spices did not fall. It rose, because people were desperate, and desperation drives demand in ways that rationality never can. And then there was status. Perhaps more than anything else, spices were a signal. To serve a meal heavily spiced in medieval Europe was to announce to your guests that you were wealthy enough to afford the most expensive ingredients on earth. Pepper on the table was the equivalent of a luxury car in the driveway. Nutmeg grated over food was a performance of power. The aristocracy of Europe did not just consume spices. They displayed them. They competed over them. They gave them as diplomatic gifts. A bag of pepper was a serious present between kings. All of this demand, enormous and growing and seemingly insatiable, had one fundamental problem. Europe could not produce a single grain of it. Every spice that European consumers craved came from somewhere impossibly far away. Pepper came from the Malabar coast of India. Nutmeg and cloves came from a tiny cluster of islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago called the Banda Islands, a place so remote that most Europeans had no accurate idea where it was or even whether it truly existed. Cinnamon came from Ceylon, the island we now call Sri Lanka. Getting these things from where they grew to where they were wanted required crossing thousands of miles of ocean and overland routes through territories controlled by Arab merchants, Ottoman middlemen, and Venetian traders who each took their cut and revealed as little as possible about where the goods actually came from. By the time a sack of pepper reached a market in London or Paris or Lisbon, it had passed through so many hands, been taxed so many times, and traveled so many thousands of miles that its price bore almost no relationship to what it had cost at the source. The people who grew the spices saw almost none of the money. The people who controlled the routes between the source and the consumer became extraordinarily wealthy. And the European powers watching this river of profit flow through other people's hands began to ask a question that would change the shape of the world. What if we cut out the middleman entirely? What if we found our own route? Our own direct line from the source to the consumer, controlled by us, taxed by us, profited by us alone? That question is where the age of exploration actually begins. Not in curiosity. Not in the noble pursuit of knowledge or the romantic desire to chart unknown waters. It begins in commerce. It begins in the cold calculation of profit margins and supply chains and the burning desire of European monarchies to stop paying Arab and Ottoman and Venetian intermediaries for goods they believed they had every right to access directly. The ships that left Lisbon and Seville and Amsterdam in the 15th and 16th centuries were not primarily vessels of discovery. They were vessels of economic aggression. And the world they found when they reached the sources of the spice trade was not an empty world waiting to be civilized. It was a world of sophisticated kingdoms, established trade networks, and peoples who had been growing and trading these commodities for centuries before any European sailor appeared on the horizon. What happened when those two worlds met is the part of the story that the age of exploration tends to leave out of its own mythology. And it is exactly where we are going next. The Portuguese arrived on the Malabar coast of India in 1498. Vasco da Gama had done what many believed was impossible. He had sailed around the southern tip of Africa, navigated the Indian Ocean, and found the source. The direct route. The thing that European merchants and monarchs had been dreaming about for generations. He had done it without Arab pilots for most of the journey, without Ottoman permission, and without paying a single toll to the Venetian middlemen who had grown fat on the overland spice routes for centuries. When he returned to Lisbon with a cargo of pepper and cinnamon, the profit on that single voyage was enough to cover the entire cost of the expedition 60 times over. 60 times. Let that number sit with you for a moment. One voyage. One cargo of spices. 60 times the investment returned. There has arguably never been a return on investment of that magnitude in the history of global commerce before or since. The Portuguese crown looked at those numbers and made a decision that was, from a purely financial standpoint, completely logical. They were going back. And this time they were not coming to trade. They were coming to control. What followed was not exploration. It was conquest dressed in the language of exploration. The Portuguese did not negotiate their way into the spice trade. They shot their way into it. Vasco da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502 set the tone for everything that came after. When he encountered a ship carrying Muslim pilgrims returning from Mecca, he had it set on fire with the passengers locked inside. Men, women, children. Several hundred people burned or drowned while da Gama's fleet watched. He did this to send a message to the Arab merchants who had controlled Indian Ocean trade for centuries. The message was simple. This ocean belongs to us now. The Portuguese built a chain of fortified trading posts, which they called feitorias, along the coastlines of Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. These were not trading partners. They were armed checkpoints. Any ship that wanted to trade in the Indian Ocean was required to carry a Portuguese pass, a cartaz, and pay Portuguese taxes. Ships without a cartaz were seized or sunk. The Portuguese had essentially privatized an entire ocean and were charging the world for the privilege of using it. For a few decades, it worked spectacularly. Lisbon became one of the wealthiest cities in Europe almost overnight. The Portuguese crown was pulling in spice revenues that made the old Venetian profits look modest. The city filled with pepper warehouses and exotic goods and the kind of architectural ambition that only extraordinary wealth makes possible. The monuments they built during this period, the ones you can still visit in Lisbon today, were paid for almost entirely with spice money. Beautiful buildings financed by violence on the other side of the world. That is a formula that European powers would return to again and again over the next 4 centuries. But the Portuguese model had a structural weakness that its architects either did not see or chose to ignore. Controlling an ocean is not the same as controlling a commodity at its source. The spices still had to be grown somewhere. And the places where they were grown were not empty territories. They were inhabited by people with their own political structures, their own military capabilities, and their own ideas about who had the right to profit from what their land produced. The Banda Islands sit in the eastern reaches of the Indonesian archipelago, a scattering of tiny volcanic islands so small that you could walk across the largest of them in a few hours. They were, in the early 16th century, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew naturally. The entire global supply of nutmeg came from this handful of islands in the middle of an ocean that most Europeans could not have pointed to on a map. The Bandanese people had been trading their nutmeg with Arab and Javanese merchants for centuries. They had a functioning economy, a social structure, and an entirely reasonable expectation that they would continue to profit from the thing that grew in their soil. The Dutch had other ideas. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, arrived in the Banda Islands in the early 17th century with a business plan that dispensed entirely with the inconvenience of negotiation. They wanted a monopoly on nutmeg. Complete, total, and exclusive. No other buyer. No other seller. Every nutmeg that left the Banda Islands would leave on a Dutch ship, at a price set by the Dutch, sold to markets controlled by the Dutch. The Bandanese, who had spent centuries trading freely with whoever offered the best price, refused. They continued to sell to English traders and others who offered better terms. The VOC's response to this commercial disagreement was one of the most complete acts of destruction in the history of colonial trade. In 1621, Jan Pietersoen Cohen, the VOC's governor-general, arrived in the Banda Islands with a fleet and a militia that included Japanese mercenaries. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination. The Bandanese population at the time of Dutch arrival is estimated at around 15,000 people. Within 5 years of Cohen's campaign, the population had been reduced to approximately 1,000. The rest had been killed, starved, enslaved, or driven into the ocean. Entire villages burned. The nutmeg groves, the source of everything, tended and cultivated by generations of Bandanese farmers, were handed over to Dutch colonists who worked them using enslaved labor imported from other parts of the Indonesian archipelago. The Dutch then did something that reveals, with absolute clarity, the logic driving all of this. On the island of Run, a tiny speck of land in the Banda group that the English had managed to hold onto, nutmeg trees that fell outside Dutch control were ordered to be destroyed. Not harvested. Destroyed. The VOC sent parties to burn and uproot nutmeg trees across islands they could not fully control because they understood that the value of their monopoly depended entirely on scarcity. If nutmeg grew somewhere they did not control, it was worthless to them. So they killed the trees. They killed trees that had taken decades to grow. On islands they had just depopulated. To protect a profit margin. That is not trade. That is not commerce. That is not the romantic story of brave sailors crossing unknown oceans in pursuit of adventure. That is what the spice trade actually was, underneath the mythology. A system of violence so total and so calculated that it erased entire peoples from the earth in the service of keeping pepper and nutmeg expensive in European markets. And the most disturbing part is that it worked. For the better part of a century, the Dutch monopoly on nutmeg held. The VOC paid its shareholders extraordinary dividends. The streets of Amsterdam filled with the kind of wealth that built the golden age of Dutch painting, funded some of the greatest art in human history, and created a city that people still travel from around the world to admire. All of it paid for by 15,000 people who no longer existed. By the middle of the 18th century, the spice trade was beginning to change in ways that no monopoly, no matter how brutally enforced, could prevent. The seeds, quite literally, were getting out. The French were the first to crack the Dutch nutmeg monopoly in a meaningful way. Pierre Poivre, a French horticulturalist whose name translates with almost comedic appropriateness to Peter Pepper, had spent years obsessing over the Dutch stranglehold on the Spice Islands. He understood that the monopoly was not a natural condition. It was an artificial one, maintained by violence and the careful control of living plants. And living plants, unlike gold or silver or manufactured goods, had a vulnerability that no navy could fully protect. They could be smuggled. Not the spice itself, which was already circulating in global markets at Dutch-controlled prices, but the seeds. The seedlings. The biological source code of the entire monopoly. Poivre mounted several attempts to steal nutmeg and clove plants from the Banda Islands and surrounding areas. His early efforts failed. The Dutch were vigilant, and the penalty for anyone caught assisting in the removal of spice plants was death. But in 1770, after years of persistence that bordered on obsession, Poivre succeeded in smuggling live nutmeg and clove seedlings out of the Indonesian archipelago and transporting them to the French colonial island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. From Mauritius, the plants were eventually propagated and distributed to French colonies in the Caribbean, in Zanzibar, in Reunion. The Dutch monopoly, the thing that had justified the extermination of the Bandanese people a century and a half earlier, was broken not by a competing navy or a diplomatic agreement, but by one determined botanist with a bag of stolen seedlings. The irony is almost unbearable. 15,000 people had been killed to protect a monopoly over a plant. And the monopoly was ended by smuggling the plant out in someone's luggage. But the story does not end with nutmeg. Because while the Dutch were burning villages in the Banda Islands to protect their spice monopoly, something else was happening on the other side of the world that would eventually make the entire premise of the spice trade obsolete. Europe was developing a taste for new commodities. Sugar, coffee, tea, tobacco, cotton. These were not spices in the traditional sense. They were not small, dry, easily transported luxury goods that could make a fortune in a sack. They were bulk commodities that required land and labor, and an entirely different economic architecture to produce and distribute at scale. The shift from the spice trade to the plantation economy is one of the most consequential transitions in the history of global commerce. And it was not a transition that made the world more just. If anything, it made it less so. Because the plantation system that produced sugar in the Caribbean and tobacco in Virginia and cotton in the American South ran not on the semi-voluntary labor of indigenous trading partners but on the forced labor of enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic in conditions of almost unimaginable brutality. The economic logic was identical to what the Dutch had applied in the Banda Islands. Find a commodity that European consumers will pay for. Control the production of that commodity completely. Minimize the cost of labor by eliminating the humanity of the people performing it. Extract maximum profit. The names of the commodities changed. The structure of the exploitation did not. What the spice trade had pioneered, in other words, was not just a set of specific trade routes or a particular set of commercial relationships. It had pioneered a template, a way of thinking about the relationship between European capital and non-European labor and non-European land that would be applied again and again, across 4 centuries and across every inhabited continent on Earth. The Bandunese nutmeg farmers who were exterminated in 1621 were not an anomaly in the history of global trade. They were a precedent. This is the part of economic history that tends to get smoothed over in the standard account of how global trade developed. The standard account emphasizes innovation, the financial instruments that made long-distance trade possible, the navigational technology that opened new routes, the entrepreneurial courage of the merchants and company men who risked capital in pursuit of profit in unknown markets. And these things are real. They happened. They matter. But they did not happen in a vacuum. They happened on top of a foundation of violence that was so pervasive and so systematically applied that it became, after a while, invisible. Not invisible to the people experiencing it. Invisible to the people benefiting from it. The consumers of Europe who sweetened their tea with Caribbean sugar and seasoned their food with Indonesian pepper and dressed in American cotton were not, for the most part, thinking about the supply chains behind those products. They were thinking about the taste of the tea, the warmth of the cloth, the pleasure of a well-seasoned meal. The distance between the consumer and the conditions of production was not accidental. It was a feature of the system, not a bug. Keep the violence far enough away and the people benefiting from it can maintain, in good conscience, the belief that they are simply enjoying the fruits of a well-functioning market. That distance is still with us. The supply chains are longer now, and the violence is less naked, less direct, less easy to point to. But the structure, the extraction of value from places and people with less power by markets controlled by people and institutions with more, did not end when the spice monopolies collapsed. It adapted. It found new commodities and new geographies and new justifications. It put on different clothes and gave itself different names and continued doing what it had always done. The Banda Islands today are a quiet place. The population never fully recovered from what was done to it in 1621. The nutmeg trees still grow there, tended now by descendants of the enslaved laborers the Dutch imported after they destroyed the original population. The spice that once justified the extermination of 15,000 people sells for a few dollars a jar in supermarkets around the world. Nobody thinks about where it came from when they shake it over their food. Nobody thinks about what it cost. That forgetting is not innocent. It is the last dividend paid by the spice trade to the civilization that built itself on top of it. The ability to enjoy the inheritance without examining how it was acquired. The freedom to season your food without knowing the price that someone else paid for that freedom, centuries ago, on a tiny volcanic island in the middle of an ocean most people will never see. That is what the spice trade really was. Not an adventure. Not a triumph of human ingenuity and commercial daring. It was the first great demonstration that the global economy, from its very beginning, was designed to make certain people wealthy by making certain other people expendable. And it worked so well, and for so long, that we are still living inside the world it built. The pepper in your kitchen has a history. And that history has blood in it.